You don't belong here. The sneers cut through the sterile air of Meridian Corporate Tower's 47th floor as a petite woman in a simple gray suit quietly stepped into the executive boardroom. But when she calmly took her seat at the head of the mahogany table 30 seconds later, the room's most powerful executives would discover that the quiet stranger they just cornered was about to become their new commander. The morning sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of what employees called the Fortress, Meridian Industries' imposing headquarters that dominated the Seattle skyline like a glass and steel monument to corporate power. On this particular Tuesday, the building hummed with nervous energy as news had spread through every department. Today was the day the mysterious new chief executive officer would finally be revealed to the senior leadership team. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Amelia Reeves moved through the marble lobby with the kind of purposeful invisibility that came from years of practice. At 5'3" with shoulder-length auburn hair and wearing an unremarkable off-the-rack business suit from a department store, she looked like exactly what she appeared to be, a mid-level employee who'd somehow gotten lost on the wrong floor. The security guards barely glanced at her modest employee badge as she passed through the turnstiles. The executive assistants didn't bother looking up from their monitors as she walked past their polished desks. Everything about her presence screamed ordinary, from her sensible black flats that made no sound on the Italian marble to her simple leather portfolio that looked like it had seen years of everyday use. She carried herself with the quiet competence of someone accustomed to blending into backgrounds, someone who'd learned that being underestimated was often more valuable than being noticed. The 47th floor was a different world entirely, a realm of mahogany panels, Persian rugs, and oil paintings that cost more than most people's annual salaries. This was where Meridian Industries senior vice presidents, regional directors, and department heads conducted the kind of high-stakes business that moved markets and shaped industries. It was a place where power dressed in handmade Italian suits and spoke in the confident tones of people who'd never doubted their right to occupy the highest levels of corporate hierarchy. The executive boardroom itself was a temple to authority, a massive oval table carved from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood, surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than luxury cars. The walls displayed awards, certificates, and photographs documenting Meridian's rise to become one of the most influential technology conglomerates in the Pacific Northwest. Everything in the room was designed to intimidate, to remind anyone who entered that they were in the presence of genuine power. As Amelia approached the boardroom's imposing double doors, she could hear voices from within, the kind of animated discussion that came from executives who believed themselves to be the masters of their universe. She recognized the tones, if not the specific words. Confidence bordering on arrogance, the casual dismissal of anyone they deemed beneath their consideration, the comfortable assumption that their positions at the top of the corporate food chain were both deserved and permanent. She paused for a moment outside the doors, her hand resting lightly on the brass handle. Through the frosted glass panels, she could see the silhouettes of 8 figures arranged around the conference table, the senior leadership team that had been running Meridian Industries through a period of stagnation and declining market share. These were people who'd grown comfortable with the status quo, who'd forgotten that success in the technology sector required constant evolution and adaptation. The conversation inside grew more animated as someone mentioned the incoming CEO. Probably another corporate shark from the East Coast. One voice declared with the kind of dismissive confidence that came from never having been seriously challenged. These board appointments are always about connections rather than competence. Another voice chimed in, equally assured. Whoever it is, they'll need to understand how we do things here. This isn't some startup that can be restructured overnight. We've got systems, protocols, established relationships with clients and vendors. Amelia smiled slightly at the irony. If they only knew that their new CEO had been observing their systems and protocols for the past 6 months, working 3 levels down in the strategic planning department under a different name, documenting every inefficiency and identifying every executive who'd prioritized personal comfort over company performance. The deception hadn't been malicious, it had been necessary. When the board of directors had recruited her to turn around Meridian's declining fortunes, she'd requested 6 months of anonymity to conduct what she called environmental assessment. She needed to understand the company's problems from the inside, to see how decisions made in executive boardrooms translated into day-to-day operations on the lower floors. What she'd discovered during those months had been both enlightening and disappointing. Meridian Industries had all the resources necessary for success: talented engineers, innovative products, loyal customers, but the senior leadership team had become insular and complacent. They made decisions based on outdated assumptions, ignored feedback from lower-level employees, and treated anyone below the vice president level as essentially invisible. Today, that invisibility would end. Amelia took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and pushed open the boardroom doors. The conversation inside stopped abruptly as 8 pairs of eyes turned toward the unexpected intrusion. She could see the immediate calculation in their expressions: confusion at her presence, irritation at the interruption, and the kind of dismissive assessment that people in power automatically applied to anyone who didn't immediately signal their own importance. The silence stretched for several seconds as she stood in the doorway, her modest appearance a stark contrast to the room's opulent surroundings. Then the questions began, each one carrying the unmistakable tone of authority challenged by presumed insignificance. The silence that greeted Amelia's entrance lasted exactly 3 seconds before the room erupted into a chorus of dismissive authority. "Excuse me, miss," came the sharp voice of Regional Director Theodore Harrington III, his Harvard MBA and inherited trust fund evident in every syllable. "This is a closed executive meeting. I'm afraid you'll need to leave immediately." His tone carried the practiced condescension of someone who'd spent his entire career speaking down to people he considered beneath his station. Vice President of Operations Janet Morrison leaned back in her leather chair with the kind of predatory smile that had earned her the nickname the Barracuda throughout the company's lower floors. "Security must be getting sloppy if random employees are wandering into the C-suite," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Though I suppose that's what happens when you hire budget guards instead of proper professionals." "How did you even get up here?" demanded Chief Financial Officer David Sterling, his voice rising with genuine incredulity. "Don't you people understand that executive floors require special clearance? This isn't some public library where anyone can wander around freely." The casual use of "you people" hung in the air like toxic smoke, revealing assumptions that went far deeper than simple corporate hierarchy. To these executives, Amelia wasn't just an unwelcome intruder, she was evidence of a natural order being disrupted, a reminder that their carefully constructed world of privilege and power could be penetrated by ordinary people who didn't understand their place. Senior Vice President of Technology Ryan Blackstone adjusted his Italian silk tie with the unconscious gesture of someone reassuring himself of his own importance. "This is exactly the kind of security breach that makes our clients nervous," he declared, as if Amelia's presence represented a fundamental threat to national security. "We're discussing sensitive corporate strategy here, not hosting a company picnic." "Someone needs to call building security," snapped Marketing Director Patricia Fleming, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone accustomed to having her smallest requests treated as urgent commands. "And we need to find out which department is responsible for this person, so we can address their supervision issues." The word "person" carried a particular venom, delivered with the kind of pause that made it clear she'd considered using far less polite terminology. Patricia had climbed the corporate ladder through a combination of ruthless networking and strategic cruelty, and she saw any disruption of established hierarchy as a personal affront to the natural order she'd fought so hard to join. Chief Operating Officer Marcus Drummond, a man whose corner office was decorated with photographs of himself shaking hands with various politicians and celebrities, stood up from his chair with theatrical authority. "Young lady," he announced, his voice projecting across the room like a judge delivering a verdict, "I don't know how you got past security or what kind of misguided confidence brought you to this floor, but you are severely out of place here. This is where real business gets conducted," added Vice President of Sales Catherine Westbrook, her voice carrying the dismissive certainty of someone who'd never questioned her right to occupy the highest levels of corporate power. "This isn't some employee suggestion meeting or diversity workshop. We're discussing million-dollar decisions that affect thousands of jobs." The assumption embedded in her words was clear. Someone who looked like Amelia, someone small, quiet, and modestly dressed, couldn't possibly understand the complexities of executive decision-making. In their world, Competence was measured by appearance, authority was derived from title, and wisdom was assumed to correlate directly with salary level. "I have to ask," said Theodore Harrington with the kind of fake concern that barely masked his genuine irritation. "Are you perhaps having some kind of episode? Sometimes stress can cause people to behave in ways that are completely inappropriate for their situation." The suggestion carried multiple layers of condescension. Not only was Amelia obviously out of place, but her persistence in remaining in the room could only be explained by some form of mental instability. It was the kind of gaslighting that powerful people used when confronted by situations that didn't conform to their expectations. Janet Morrison reached for the conference phone at the center of the table, her movements deliberate and theatrical. "I'm calling security," she announced, as if this declaration would somehow restore the natural order that Amelia's presence had disrupted. "This has gone on long enough." "Wait," interrupted David Sterling, a new thought apparently occurring to him. "Maybe she's some kind of corporate spy. You hear about these industrial espionage cases where competitors send people to infiltrate executive meetings." His paranoia was typical of executives who'd grown so disconnected from their own companies that they viewed any unexpected presence as a potential threat. Ryan Blackstone nodded sagely, as if Sterling had revealed a profound truth. That would explain the boldness. No legitimate employee would walk into a senior leadership meeting uninvited. She must be working for someone with serious resources. The irony of their speculation was lost on them entirely. They were so convinced that authority and competence existed only at their level that they couldn't conceive of any legitimate reason for someone like Amelia to be in their boardroom. Every explanation they generated, mental instability, security breach, corporate espionage, reinforced their fundamental assumption that she simply didn't belong among them. Patricia Fleming stood up as well, her chair rolling backward with dramatic emphasis. "I don't care if she's a spy, a lost employee, or having some kind of breakdown," she declared. "This is completely unacceptable, and someone is going to answer for how this happened." The executives had formed a kind of unconscious coalition, their individual authority combining into collective outrage. They weren't just dealing with an unexpected interruption. They were defending the very foundation of their professional identity. The belief that their positions at the top of Meridian Industries reflected some fundamental superiority that couldn't be challenged by someone who looked like she belonged 3 floors down in middle management. Marcus Drummond moved toward the door, apparently intending to physically escort Amelia from the room. "Come on," he said, his voice mixing impatience with the kind of patronizing gentleness reserved for children and the mentally impaired. "Let's get you back to wherever you're supposed to be before this becomes an even bigger problem." The assumption in his approach was complete. Not only was Amelia obviously out of place, but she was clearly incapable of recognizing this fact herself. In his mind, she needed to be guided back to her proper station by someone with the wisdom and authority to understand the corporate hierarchy she'd accidentally violated. As 8 of the most powerful executives at Meridian Industries stood united in their certainty that they were dealing with an insignificant intruder, none of them noticed the small smile that played at the corners of Amelia's mouth, or the quiet confidence in her eyes that suggested she knew something they didn't. Amelia moved with deliberate calm toward the massive rosewood conference table, her modest flats making barely a whisper against the Persian rug. The executives' voices rose around her like a storm of indignation, but she navigated through their outrage with the serene focus of someone who had faced far more intimidating challenges than a room full of corporate blowhards. "Excuse me," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the cacophony with surprising clarity. The simple interruption was so unexpected that several executives actually stopped mid-sentence, momentarily thrown off balance by her audacity to speak rather than simply retreating in embarrassment. Theodore Harrington recovered first, his face flushing with the kind of righteous anger that came from having his authority questioned by someone he considered fundamentally inferior. "Did you just interrupt me?" he demanded, his voice rising to the pitch typically reserved for particularly incompetent subordinates. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" But Amelia was no longer listening to his bluster. Instead, she had moved to the wall-mounted presentation screen where the morning's agenda was still displayed, a carefully crafted schedule of discussions about quarterly projections, market positioning, and strategic initiatives. Her eyes scanned the bullet points with the kind of analytical intensity that suggested she was seeing patterns and connections that had escaped the room's supposed experts. "Your Q3 revenue projections," she said conversationally, pointing to one of the agenda items. "They're based on the Henderson manufacturing contract, aren't they?" The observation was delivered with such casual confidence that it momentarily silenced the room's protests. Janet Morrison's expression shifted from outraged dismissal to suspicious confusion. "How could you possibly know about Henderson manufacturing?" she demanded. "That's confidential information restricted to senior leadership level." Amelia didn't answer the question directly. Instead, she moved to the whiteboard adjacent to the presentation screen and picked up one of the expensive German-made markers that the executives used for their strategic planning sessions. Without asking permission, she began writing a series of numbers and calculations with the fluid precision of someone who had performed similar analyses countless times before. "Henderson Manufacturing is restructuring their supply chain," she continued, her voice maintaining the same conversational tone while her hand moved across the whiteboard with mathematical certainty. "They're moving 60% of their production to automated systems over the next 18 months. Which means their demand for Meridian's logistics software will drop by approximately 40% starting in Q4. The room fell silent except for the soft scratching of the marker against the whiteboard. Even Marcus Drummond, who had been advancing toward Amelia with the intention of physically escorting her from the room, stopped in his tracks as the implications of her words began to penetrate the fog of his indignation. "That's impossible," Ryan Blackstone said. But his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "Henderson signed a 3-year contract extension just 6 months ago. They're locked in through 2026. Amelia completed her calculations and turned back to face the room, the marker still in her hand like a teacher addressing a particularly slow class. "Contract extensions include automation clauses that allow for reduced service requirements when clients implement efficiency improvements," she explained patiently. "Henderson filed their automation plans with the Department of Commerce 3 weeks ago. It's public record for anyone who knows where to look." The silence that followed was different from the earlier outrage. It was the quiet of people suddenly realizing that they might be dealing with someone who understood their business better than they did. Patricia Fleming was the first to voice what several others were thinking. "How do you know about automation clauses in our contracts?" she asked, her voice missing its earlier venom. "That information is restricted to legal and executive review." Instead of answering, Amelia moved to another section of the whiteboard and began sketching out what appeared to be an organizational chart. But this wasn't the standard corporate hierarchy that decorated Meridian's annual reports. This was a detailed breakdown of actual workflow patterns, decision bottlenecks, and communication failures that plagued the company's day-to-day operations. "Your marketing department hasn't communicated with your engineering team about client feedback in over 8 months," she observed while drawing connecting lines between different organizational boxes. "Meanwhile, your sales team is making promises about product capabilities that your technical staff can't deliver on current timelines." David Sterling leaned forward in his chair, his earlier confidence beginning to crack under the weight of uncomfortably accurate observations. "Those are internal operational details," he said slowly. "Someone would need extensive access to multiple department reports to know." "The Nakamura project," Amelia interrupted, adding another series of numbers to her growing diagram. 18 months behind schedule, 200% over budget, and your client is threatening to terminate the contract because your team promised features that haven't even entered beta testing. The mention of the Nakamura project sent a visible shockwave through the room. This was information that had been carefully contained within the highest levels of executive briefings, a disaster that the senior leadership had been desperately trying to resolve before it became public knowledge. Catherine Westbrook's face had gone pale, her earlier smugness replaced by something approaching genuine concern. "The Nakamura situation is classified at the highest level," she whispered. "Board members don't even have access to those details." Amelia set down the marker and walked back toward the conference table, her movements still carrying that same unhurried confidence that had marked her entrance into the room. But now the executives were watching her with different eyes, no longer seeing a lost employee who had wandered into the wrong meeting, but recognizing someone who possessed knowledge that should have been impossible for an outsider to obtain. Your cost overruns on the Nakamura project aren't just about poor planning, she continued, her voice maintaining its calm, analytical tone. They're the result of fundamental communication breakdowns between departments that have been operating in silos for the past 2 years. Your engineering team is designing solutions for problems that your sales team misunderstood, while your marketing department is promoting capabilities that your legal team hasn't cleared for public release. The accuracy of her assessment was devastating in its precision. These weren't vague criticisms or generic corporate consulting observations. They were specific, detailed insights into failures that the executives had been struggling to address for months without success. Ryan Blackstone sat down heavily in his chair, the fight seeming to drain out of him as the implications of Amelia's knowledge began to sink in. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Theodore Harrington was still clinging to his earlier assumptions, though his voice now carried an edge of desperation rather than confidence. "Corporate espionage," he declared, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as the room. "She's obviously working for a competitor. There's no other explanation for this level of detailed intelligence." But Janet Morrison was studying Amelia's face with the analytical intensity of someone who had built her career on reading people and situations. Something about the woman's calm competence, her obvious familiarity with Meridian's internal operations, and her complete lack of intimidation in the face of executive authority was triggering recognition patterns that Morrison couldn't quite identify. "Wait," she said slowly, her voice cutting through the room's confused murmur. "Wait just a minute." Amelia smiled for the first time since entering the room, not the nervous expression of someone caught out of place, but the patient expression of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to reveal a truth that would change everything the executives thought they understood about their situation. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught something at Amelia's wrist as she reached for her simple leather portfolio, a flash of metal that might have been jewelry, or might have been something far more significant to anyone who knew what to look for. The revelation of Amelia's impossible knowledge had created a temporary truce in the boardroom's hostilities. But the fragile quiet shattered like expensive crystal when Marcus Drummond decided that acknowledging her competence was somehow more threatening than maintaining his original assumptions. "I don't care how much inside information you've managed to steal," he declared, his voice rising with the desperate aggression of someone whose worldview was being systematically dismantled. "Corporate espionage is a federal crime, and I'm not going to sit here while some industrial spy lectures us about our own company." His words seemed to give the other executives permission to retreat back into their comfortable prejudices rather than confront the unsettling possibility that they might be fundamentally wrong about the situation. Patricia Fleming stood up again, her earlier uncertainty replaced by renewed indignation. "Marcus is absolutely right," she announced with the kind of theatrical certainty that suggested she was performing for an audience rather than engaging in genuine analysis. "No legitimate employee could possibly have access to the information she's been discussing. She's obviously working for Henderson Manufacturing or one of our other competitors." The accusation carried a particular malice because it allowed the executives to transform Amelia from an uncomfortably knowledgeable critic into a criminal threat, a shift that justified any level of hostility they might want to express. Ryan Blackstone seized on this narrative with visible relief. "Think about it logically," he said, his voice carrying the condescending tone of someone explaining obvious facts to children. "She walks into our most sensitive executive meeting, demonstrates detailed knowledge of our confidential projects, and starts pointing out supposed weaknesses in our operations. That's textbook corporate intelligence gathering." Janet Morrison nodded vigorously, apparently convinced by her colleague's reasoning. "And the timing is suspicious too. Right before our new CEO is supposed to arrive? Someone's trying to destabilize our leadership transition by planting doubts about our competence." Theodore Harrington had found his second wind, his Harvard-trained legal mind seizing on the espionage theory with prosecutorial enthusiasm. "Industrial theft of trade secrets carries serious federal penalties," he declared, pointing at Amelia with the dramatic flair of a courtroom attorney. "We're talking about potential prison time here, not just corporate discipline." The shift in the room's dynamics was almost palpable as the executives transformed their collective confusion into righteous anger. Rather than questioning how their operations had become transparent enough for an outsider to analyze so thoroughly, They were choosing to attack the messenger who had exposed their vulnerabilities. David Sterling pulled out his phone with theatrical urgency. "I'm calling our head of corporate security," he announced. "And probably the FBI. If we're dealing with industrial espionage, this needs to be handled by professionals who understand the legal implications." Catherine Westbrook joined the chorus with her own theory about Amelia's motivations. "She's probably been planted here for months, maybe years," she suggested, her voice carrying the paranoid certainty of someone who had found a conspiracy theory that explained away all uncomfortable realities. Working her way up through the organization, gaining access to sensitive information, building a comprehensive intelligence profile. The irony of her speculation was breathtaking. She was essentially describing exactly what Amelia had been doing, but assigning criminal rather than legitimate business motives to the activity. Marcus Drummond seized on this theory with visible enthusiasm. "That would explain everything," he declared, as if he had solved a complex puzzle through superior analytical thinking. "The detailed knowledge of our contracts, the familiarity with our internal operations, the way she walked in here like she belonged. She's been conducting a long-term intelligence operation." Patricia Fleming was already mentally composing the narrative she would share with other executives throughout the industry. "This is exactly the kind of sophisticated corporate espionage that everyone needs to be aware of," she announced, her voice carrying the self-important tone of someone who believed she had uncovered a major security threat. "They don't just hack our computers anymore. They infiltrate our organizations with human assets." The executives were feeding off each other's certainty, their collective paranoia growing stronger with each supporting voice. Ryan Blackstone stood up and began pacing behind his chair, his agitation increasing as he developed his theory about Amelia's supposed criminal activities. "She's probably been recording our conversations, photographing our documents, maybe even accessing our computer systems after hours," he suggested, his voice rising with each accusation. "We need to conduct a complete security audit of every system she might have had access to." Theodore Harrington was already thinking about the legal ramifications and how they might affect his own career trajectory. "The board of directors is going to want answers about how our security protocols were compromised," he declared. "Someone's going to be held accountable for this breach." The implicit threat was clear. If heads were going to roll over this supposed security failure, he was going to make sure they weren't his. Janet Morrison picked up on the same concern, her voice taking on the defensive edge of someone positioning herself to avoid blame. "I've been saying for months that our employee screening procedures needed to be updated," she claimed, though no one in the room could remember her making any such recommendations. "But apparently some people thought our existing security measures were adequate." David Sterling looked up from his phone with the satisfied expression of someone who had taken decisive action. "Corporate security is sending a team up immediately," he announced, "and they're contacting the FBI's white-collar crime division. We're going to get to the bottom of this." The executives had worked themselves into a state of collective indignation that bordered on mob mentality. They were no longer seeing Amelia as a person to be reasoned with. She had become a symbol of everything that threatened their comfortable assumptions about corporate hierarchy and their own professional competence. Catherine Westbrook moved closer to the conference table, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone of someone sharing sensitive intelligence. "We need to be careful about what we say in front of her from this point forward," she warned her colleagues. "Everything we discuss could be reported back to her handlers." Marcus Drummond was already planning how to spin the situation to minimize damage to his own reputation. "The important thing is that we identified the threat before she could complete whatever mission she was given," he declared, his voice carrying the self-congratulatory tone of someone who believed he had demonstrated superior vigilance. "Actually," Patricia Fleming added with malicious satisfaction, "this could work out in our favor. When the new CEO arrives and sees how effectively we handled a sophisticated security breach, it'll demonstrate our competence under pressure." The executives had convinced themselves that they were the heroes of this story, vigilant guardians who had exposed a dangerous threat to corporate security. They were so invested in this narrative that they had completely stopped questioning whether their assumptions might be wrong. Ryan Blackstone returned to his seat with the satisfied expression of someone who had solved a complex problem through superior reasoning. "I have to admit she was good," he said, his voice carrying grudging professional respect for what he assumed was criminal expertise. If she hadn't overplayed her hand with those detailed operational insights, she might have maintained her cover indefinitely. Theodore Harrington nodded sagely, as if he had always suspected something wasn't quite right about the situation. There were warning signs if you knew what to look for, he claimed, though he hadn't identified any such signs until after Amelia's knowledge became impossible to ignore. The morning sun had shifted position during their extended confrontation, casting new shadows across the boardroom as 8 of Meridian Industries' most senior executives congratulated themselves on their detective work, while completely missing the most important clue that had been sitting in front of them the entire time. None of them noticed that Amelia had remained perfectly calm throughout their escalating accusations, showing neither the fear of someone caught in criminal activity nor the indignation of someone falsely accused. Instead, she watched their performance with the patient expression of someone waiting for a group of children to finish their tantrum before the adults could resume their conversation. While the executives continued building their elaborate conspiracy theories, Amelia reached into her simple leather portfolio with movements that were both deliberate and unhurried. The gesture was so natural, so devoid of dramatic flair, that initially none of the accusers noticed what she was doing. They were too busy congratulating themselves on their superior detective work to pay attention to the evidence that was about to shatter every assumption they had constructed. "Before security arrives," Amelia said quietly, her voice cutting through their animated discussion with the kind of calm authority that somehow commanded attention despite its modest volume, "there's something you should probably see." Her words carried an undertone of amusement that was so subtle it could have been imagination. But there was something about her complete lack of concern in the face of their accusations that should have been a warning sign to anyone paying careful attention. Corporate spies caught in the act didn't typically maintain such composure when facing federal prosecution. Patricia Fleming turned toward her with the impatient irritation of someone whose moment of triumph was being interrupted by irrelevant details. "Whatever forged credentials you're planning to show us won't change anything," she declared with the confident dismissal of someone who believed she had already solved the puzzle. Professional intelligence operatives always carry convincing documentation, but Amelia wasn't reaching for credentials. Instead, she withdrew what appeared to be a standard corporate identification badge, the kind that every Meridian Industries employee carried for building access and security purposes. At first glance, it looked unremarkable. A simple plastic card with a magnetic stripe, a barcode, and what appeared to be a standard employee photograph. Marcus Drummond glanced at the badge dismissively, his voice carrying the condescending patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. "Employee badges can be easily forged," he announced, as if this observation demonstrated superior understanding of corporate security protocols. Any competent intelligence operation would include fake identification as part of their infiltration toolkit. Theodore Harrington leaned forward slightly, his legal training making him more curious about the details than his colleagues. "Let me see that," he demanded, extending his hand with the authoritative gesture of someone accustomed to having his requests immediately fulfilled. Amelia placed the badge on the conference table rather than handing it directly to him, a subtle gesture that maintained her control over the evidence while appearing to comply with his demand. The badge slid across the polished rosewood surface with a soft whisper that seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly attentive room. Theodore picked up the identification card and examined it with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained to spot inconsistencies and forgeries. His confident expression began to shift almost immediately as he processed what he was seeing. The badge appeared to be genuine, not just professionally produced, but actually issued through Meridian's official security systems. "This looks authentic," he admitted reluctantly, though his voice still carried skepticism about its ultimate significance. But sophisticated forgeries are nearly impossible to distinguish from genuine articles without specialized equipment. Ryan Blackstone moved closer to examine the badge over Theodore's shoulder, his earlier certainty beginning to show hairline cracks as he studied the identification more carefully. The photograph showed Amelia's face clearly, but something about the badge's design elements was triggering recognition patterns that he couldn't quite identify. "Wait a minute," he said slowly, his voice carrying the first hint of genuine uncertainty since their confrontation began. "This isn't a standard employee badge. Look at the border design. Janet Morrison joined the examination, her practiced eye for corporate hierarchies immediately focusing on the visual elements that indicated the badge holder's position within the company's organizational structure. What she saw made her step backward involuntarily, her face draining of color as the implications began to penetrate her consciousness. "That's impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she stared at the identification card with the horrified fascination of someone watching a traffic accident unfold in slow motion. The badge carried design elements that were reserved for Meridian Industries' highest levels of executive authority, visual indicators that were impossible to forge because they were embedded in the card's manufacturing process rather than printed on its surface. More importantly, the access codes visible on the magnetic stripe represented clearance levels that exceeded those carried by anyone currently in the room. David Sterling reached for the badge with trembling fingers, his earlier confidence in their espionage theory evaporating like morning fog as he examined details that shouldn't have been possible to replicate. The identification wasn't just authentic, it represented authority levels that made their own executive credentials look like junior management badges. "This clearance level," he said, his voice cracking slightly as he processed information that contradicted everything they had assumed about their situation. "It's higher than mine. It's higher than any of ours." Catherine Westbrook was studying the badge with the desperate intensity of someone hoping to find evidence that would preserve her understanding of corporate hierarchy. But every detail she examined only reinforced the growing certainty that they were dealing with someone whose position within Meridian Industries was far above their own. The silence that followed David's observation was qualitatively different from earlier quiet moments in their confrontation. This wasn't the pause of people gathering their thoughts or preparing new arguments. It was the stunned hush of individuals suddenly realizing that their fundamental assumptions about reality might be catastrophically wrong. Marcus Drummond took the badge with the careful movements of someone handling potentially explosive material. His examination was slower and more thorough than his colleagues, but his conclusions were identical. The identification card was not only genuine but indicated authority levels that he had assumed were reserved for board members and the company's most senior executives. "The access codes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper as he traced the magnetic stripe with one finger. "They're encrypted with current monthly rotation keys. Even our head of security doesn't have clearance to generate badges with these specifications." Patricia Fleming was staring at the badge as if it were a physical manifestation of her worst professional nightmare. Everything about Amelia's identification contradicted the narrative she had constructed about corporate espionage and security breaches. Worse, it suggested possibilities that threatened her understanding of her own position within the company's power structure. "There has to be an explanation," she said, though her voice carried the desperate edge of someone grasping for theories that would preserve her comfortable assumptions about corporate hierarchy. "Maybe the badge was stolen from a legitimate executive. Maybe she's impersonating someone with proper clearance." But Theodore Harrington was examining the photograph more carefully, comparing the image on the badge with Amelia's actual appearance. The picture wasn't a candid shot that could have been taken surreptitiously. It was a formal corporate portrait taken in Meridian's executive photography studio, complete with professional lighting and the distinctive background used exclusively for senior leadership identification materials. "The photograph was taken in our executive studio," he announced, his legal training making him focus on evidence rather than wishful thinking. "And it's recent. Probably within the last few months based on her appearance and clothing." Ryan Blackstone was studying the badge's holographic security features with the systematic attention of someone trained in technology systems. These weren't decorative elements that could be replicated with sophisticated equipment. They were quantum-encrypted identifiers that were impossible to forge using any known technology. "The holographic authentication sequences are current," he reported, his voice carrying the defeated tone of someone whose expertise had just demolished his preferred explanation for confusing events. "These security features are updated weekly using algorithms that would be impossible to crack without direct access to our central security systems." The executives passed the badge among themselves like archaeologists examining an artifact that challenged everything they thought they understood about ancient civilizations. Each examination revealed new details that reinforced the same impossible conclusion. Amelia's identification was not only genuine but indicated authority levels that exceeded their own. Janet Morrison was the first to voice what everyone in the room was beginning to understand but none wanted to acknowledge. "If this badge is authentic," she said, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone navigating through a minefield of professional implications, "then we've been making some very serious assumptions about someone whose actual position within this company is." She trailed off without completing the sentence, unable to voice conclusions that would require her to completely revise her understanding of the situation they had created for themselves. The morning light streaming through the boardroom windows seemed different now, as if the revelation about Amelia's identification had somehow altered the fundamental nature of reality within the corporate fortress they had assumed belonged exclusively to them. As 8 of Meridian Industries' most senior executives stared at a simple corporate badge that had just destroyed every comfortable assumption they held about authority, hierarchy, and their own importance, none of them noticed the slight smile playing at the corners of Amelia's mouth as she waited patiently for them to finish processing evidence that would change everything they thought they understood about their situation. The revelation of Amelia's authentic executive credentials had created a profound silence in the boardroom, but the full weight of what those credentials meant was still beyond the executive's comprehension. What they needed was context, the story of how someone who looked like a mid-level employee had come to possess authority that exceeded their own. That context was about to unfold in ways that would fundamentally alter their understanding of corporate power and their own positions within it. Amelia retrieved her badge from Marcus Drummond's trembling fingers and placed it carefully back in her portfolio. The simple gesture carried an unmistakable finality, as if she was closing the chapter on their misconceptions and preparing to reveal truths that would reshape everything they thought they knew about Meridian Industries. 6 months ago, she began, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone recounting events with historical significance. Meridian Industries was facing the worst crisis in its 30-year history. Stock prices had dropped 40% over 8 quarters. 3 major clients had terminated their contracts, and the board of directors was seriously considering breaking up the company and selling its assets to competitors. The executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the accuracy of her assessment while wondering how someone outside their circle could possess such detailed knowledge of the company's strategic challenges. Janet Morrison opened her mouth to interrupt, but something about Amelia's tone suggested that questions would be premature. The board conducted a comprehensive analysis of the company's problems. Amelia continued, her eyes moving across each executive face with the systematic attention of someone cataloging reactions. They hired McKinsey & Company to perform an organizational audit, brought in forensic accountants to examine financial practices, and commissioned a market research firm to analyze our competitive position. Theodore Harrington leaned forward slightly, his legal background making him particularly attentive to discussions of corporate governance and board-level decision-making. These weren't the kind of details that would be available to mid-level employees or industrial spies. They represented confidential executive deliberations that were restricted to the highest levels of corporate authority. The McKinsey report was particularly damning, Amelia said, reaching into her portfolio to withdraw a thick document bound in the consulting firm's distinctive blue covers. 237 pages documenting systemic failures in leadership, communication, and strategic planning that had transformed Meridian from an industry innovator into what they termed a complacent bureaucracy suffering from institutional sclerosis. She placed the report on the conference table where all the executives could see it. Several of them recognized the document immediately. It was the confidential McKinsey analysis that had been presented to the board of directors in a closed session that excluded all senior management. The fact that Amelia possessed a copy suggested access to corporate governance at levels that none of them had achieved. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Page 87 contains a particularly interesting analysis of executive performance, she continued, opening the report to a section marked with yellow highlighter. The consultants identified what they called leadership insularity, a pattern of decision-making that ignored input from lower-level employees, dismissed market feedback that contradicted existing assumptions, and prioritized personal relationships over professional competence. Ryan Blackstone's face had gone ashen as he recognized the specific criticisms that the executives had been shielded from seeing. The board had shared only sanitized summaries of the McKinsey findings with senior management, protecting them from the full extent of the consultant's harsh assessments of their performance. The report recommended immediate replacement of the entire senior leadership team, Amelia said, her voice maintaining its calm, analytical tone while delivering information that struck each executive like a personal attack. But the board was concerned that wholesale changes might destabilize the company further during an already challenging period. David Sterling reached for the report with the desperate urgency of someone hoping to find evidence that would contradict what he was hearing. But as he scanned the highlighted sections, his expression confirmed what Amelia had already revealed. The McKinsey consultants had documented failures of leadership that went far beyond simple strategic disagreements. Instead of immediate terminations, the board decided to implement what they called a leadership transition strategy. Amelia continued, retrieving another document from her portfolio. They would bring in a new chief executive officer with authority to restructure the organization, but they wanted that person to have 6 months of unobserved access to evaluate the company's operations before taking official control. Patricia Fleming was staring at the second document with the horrified fascination of someone watching her own professional obituary being read aloud. It was a board resolution dated 6 months earlier, authorizing exactly the kind of covert executive assessment that Amelia was describing. The new CEO would work within the organization under an assumed identity, she explained, observing daily operations, evaluating personnel performance, and developing restructuring plans without the artificial behavior modifications that typically occur when employees know they're being assessed by senior leadership. Catherine Westbrook's voice came out as a strangled whisper as the implications of Amelia's explanation began to penetrate her consciousness. You're saying that someone has been working here for 6 months, evaluating all of us, without our knowledge? Amelia smiled for the second time since entering the boardroom, but this expression carried none of the warmth typically associated with corporate pleasantries. It was the patient smile of someone who had been waiting months to reveal information that would fundamentally alter the professional lives of everyone in the room. The board wanted their new CEO to understand Meridian's problems from the ground up, she continued, pulling out additional documentation that detailed her covert integration into the company's organizational structure. So they created a false identity, complete with employment history, educational credentials, and references that would allow their chosen candidate to work in the strategic planning department. Marcus Drummond was studying the employment documents with the desperate concentration of someone hoping to find procedural errors that might invalidate everything he was hearing. But the paperwork was flawless, a complete professional identity that had been designed to withstand scrutiny while providing access to the company's operational details. For 6 months, I worked 3 floors down from this boardroom, Amelia said, her voice carrying a subtle emphasis on the personal pronoun that sent shockwaves through the executive's remaining assumptions. I analyzed workflow patterns, reviewed departmental communications, observed management practices, and documented the systematic failures that had reduced Meridian from an industry leader to a struggling bureaucracy. The silence that followed her revelation was profound and absolute. 8 of the company's most senior executives sat frozen in their chairs as they processed the reality that their supposed corporate spy was actually their new boss, someone who had spent months observing their failures, while they remained completely oblivious to her presence. Theodore Harrington was the first to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. You're telling us that you're the new chief executive officer of Meridian Industries, Amelia confirmed, reaching into her portfolio one final time to withdraw a formal letter bearing the letterhead of the board of directors. Appointed 6 months ago with full authority to restructure the organization as necessary to restore profitability and market competitiveness. Janet Morrison stared at the appointment letter as if it were a document written in a foreign language that she couldn't quite translate. The official board signatures were clearly visible, along with compensation details that exceeded her own salary by several %100. The board meeting this morning, Ryan Blackstone said slowly, pieces of a devastating puzzle finally clicking into place in his mind. The one where we were supposed to meet the new CEO was scheduled to formalize my transition from covert assessment to official leadership, Amelia finished for him. Instead, I find myself in the interesting position of having to introduce myself to a senior management team that spent the morning accusing me of federal crimes. The irony of their situation was breathtaking in its completeness. They had cornered, insulted, and threatened to have arrested the very person who now held absolute authority over their professional futures. Worse, they had done so while demonstrating exactly the kind of arrogant incompetence that had convinced the board of directors that wholesale leadership changes were necessary. David Sterling looked around the room as if hoping to find some escape from the nightmare that their morning had become. "This isn't possible," he whispered, though his voice carried no conviction. "Someone would have told us. There would have been procedures, notifications, some kind of official announcement." Amelia gathered her documents and returned them to her portfolio with the satisfied efficiency of someone whose carefully planned strategy had achieved exactly its intended results. "The board felt that surprise was an essential element of accurate assessment," she explained. "Executive behavior tends to become artificial when people know they're being evaluated by their superiors." As the full magnitude of their catastrophic misjudgment settled over the executives like a suffocating blanket, none of them noticed that Amelia had begun making notes in a small leather journal, observations about their reactions that would undoubtedly influence the restructuring decisions that would determine whether any of them still had jobs by the end of the week. The moment of recognition hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, thick and acrid with the residue of shattered assumptions. 8 senior executives sat in stunned paralysis as the full implications of their situation crystallized with the slow-motion inevitability of a building collapse. They had just spent an hour demonstrating to their new CEO exactly why the board of directors had determined that wholesale leadership changes were necessary. Marcus Drummond was the first to attempt damage control, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone trying to negotiate his way out of a sinking ship. "Ms. Reeves," he began, his earlier arrogance replaced by the kind of obsequious deference that marked a complete reversal of perceived power dynamics. "I think there may have been some misunderstanding about our initial reaction to your presence here." The transformation in his tone was so dramatic that it bordered on the comical. 30 minutes earlier, he had been threatening to have Amelia physically removed from the building, and now he was addressing her with the careful politeness typically reserved for visiting dignitaries. But Amelia's expression remained unchanged, her pen moving steadily across the pages of her leather journal, as she documented observations that would undoubtedly influence decisions about his future employment. Patricia Fleming cleared her throat with the nervous energy of someone preparing to deliver a speech that might determine whether she remained employed or became a cautionary tale about corporate hubris. "When we initially questioned your presence," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she chose each word with surgical precision, "we were simply following standard security protocols for protecting sensitive executive meetings." The attempt at reframing their behavior as professional diligence rather than prejudiced assumption was transparent enough to be insulting, but Patricia seemed genuinely convinced that she could retroactively transform their mockery into evidence of their security consciousness. Theodore Harrington nodded vigorously, seizing on this interpretation as if it were a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. "Exactly," he declared, his Harvard-trained mind apparently calculating that aggressive agreement might somehow mitigate the damage they had inflicted on themselves. "Corporate espionage is a real threat in today's business environment, and we were simply exercising appropriate caution when confronted with someone who appeared to have unauthorized access to confidential information." But Amelia's methodical note-taking continued uninterrupted, her documentation apparently unaffected by their attempts to recontextualize their behavior. She had observed their genuine reactions for over an hour, their automatic dismissal of her competence, their assumptions about her qualifications based on her appearance, their reflexive hostility toward someone who challenged their comfortable prejudices. Janet Morrison decided to try a different approach, her voice carrying the calculated vulnerability of someone hoping that honesty might prove more effective than rationalization. "Ms. Reeves, I want to acknowledge that our initial response may have been inappropriate," she said, her corporate training making her select words that admitted fault without accepting legal liability. "We clearly made assumptions that were not supported by the facts of your situation." Ryan Blackstone was studying Amelia's face with the desperate intensity of someone trying to read tea leaves that might reveal his professional fate. "If we had known your actual position within the company," he added, his voice carrying the imploring tone of someone begging for mercy, "our entire approach would have been completely different." The statement was intended as an apology, but it revealed something far more damaging than simple rudeness. It demonstrated that their respect was conditional on organizational hierarchy rather than individual competence. They were essentially admitting that they had treated her poorly because they believed she was beneath them in corporate status and would only show deference to someone with superior authority. David Sterling attempted to join the chorus of belated contrition, his voice carrying the practiced sincerity of someone who had spent his career managing public relations crises. "We pride ourselves on maintaining the highest standards of professional courtesy," he declared, apparently oblivious to the irony of claiming high standards immediately after demonstrating their complete absence. Catherine Westbrook was wringing her hands with the nervous energy of someone who had suddenly realized that her comfortable assumptions about corporate hierarchy might cost her everything she had worked to achieve. "There must be some way to address this situation constructively," she pleaded, her voice carrying the desperate optimism of someone hoping that acknowledgement of error might somehow undo its consequences. But Amelia's response to their collective groveling was a silence so complete that it seemed to absorb sound from the room around them. She continued writing in her journal, her pen scratching against paper with mechanical precision that suggested their apologies were being documented rather than accepted. The quiet stretched until it became uncomfortable, then painful, then genuinely terrifying for executives who had never experienced powerlessness in a corporate environment. Marcus Drummond made another attempt at salvaging the situation, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone of someone offering insider information. "Perhaps we could arrange a more formal introduction process," he suggested, as if their catastrophic first meeting could somehow be replaced with a do-over that would erase the preceding hour from corporate memory. "We could schedule a proper executive briefing," Patricia added, her voice carrying the eager enthusiasm of someone convinced she had identified a solution to their collective nightmare. "A comprehensive overview of departmental operations, current project status, strategic initiatives in development." Theodore Harrington was nodding so vigorously that he appeared to be in danger of injuring himself. "A full executive presentation," he agreed, his voice rising with excitement as he developed the concept. "PowerPoint slides, financial projections, organizational charts, everything you would need to understand our operational excellence." The suggestion revealed yet another fundamental misunderstanding of their situation. They were still operating under the assumption that Amelia needed to be educated about Meridian's operations, apparently forgetting that she had just demonstrated more comprehensive knowledge of the company's problems than any of them possessed. Worse, they seemed to believe that a formal presentation might somehow compensate for their hour-long demonstration of exactly the kind of arrogant incompetence that had convinced the board to replace them. Janet Morrison was studying Amelia's continued note-taking with growing alarm, her voice carrying the edge of someone watching her professional obituary being written in real time. "Ms. Reeves," she said, her corporate diplomacy training making her attempt to establish personal connection through direct address. "We sincerely hope that this unfortunate introduction won't negatively influence your assessment of our capabilities as senior leaders." Ryan Blackstone leaned forward in his chair with the desperate body language of someone making a final plea for clemency. "We've all been under tremendous stress lately," he explained, as if psychological pressure could somehow excuse their systematic demonstration of prejudice and incompetence. "The uncertainty about leadership transition, market pressures, the general challenges of maintaining operational excellence during periods of organizational change." David Sterling was apparently convinced that emphasizing their stress levels would generate sympathy rather than further evidence of their inability to function effectively under pressure. "The entire senior management team has been working overtime to ensure smooth operations during this transitional period," he added, his voice carrying the earnest sincerity of someone who genuinely believed that effort could compensate for results. Catherine Westbrook made one final attempt at damage control, her voice carrying the practiced humility of someone who had learned corporate contrition as a professional skill. "We're all committed to supporting your leadership vision," she declared, as if loyalty expressed after discovery of her authority could somehow compensate for the disrespect shown when they believed she was powerless. But Amelia's journal entries continued with mechanical precision, documenting not just their words but their desperation, their attempts at manipulation, and their fundamental inability to understand that their problem wasn't a simple misunderstanding that could be resolved through better communication. They had revealed their character under pressure, and that revelation was far more significant than any apology they could construct after the fact. The morning sun had shifted position again during their extended attempts at damage control, casting new shadows across the conference table where 8 senior executives waited to learn whether their careers would survive the next 30 minutes. None of them understood that their fate had actually been determined during the first 30 minutes of their encounter, when they had demonstrated exactly why the board of directors had concluded that Meridian Industries needed completely new leadership to survive in an increasingly competitive marketplace. As Amelia continued her methodical documentation of their reactions, the executives began to understand that they were no longer participants in a business meeting. They had become subjects in a case study about corporate leadership failure that would determine not just their individual futures but the entire direction of the company they had thought belonged to them. Amelia closed her leather journal with a soft snap that seemed to echo through the boardroom like a judge's gavel finalizing a verdict. The sound marked the end of her documentation phase and the beginning of what the executives would later recognize as the most professionally devastating conversation of their careers. She placed the journal carefully in her portfolio and looked up to meet 8 pairs of anxious eyes with the calm, analytical gaze of someone who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. "Before we proceed," she said, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who no longer needed to prove her position, "I should probably clarify something about my assessment methodology over the past 6 months. The board didn't just want me to evaluate Meridian's operational efficiency. They specifically asked me to identify which members of the senior leadership team were salvageable and which represented fundamental obstacles to organizational recovery." The silence that greeted this revelation was qualitatively different from earlier quiet moments in their confrontation. This wasn't confusion or shock. It was the profound stillness of people suddenly understanding that their professional lives had been under microscopic examination by someone with the authority to end their careers with a simple recommendation to the board of directors. Marcus Drummond's face had gone completely white as the implications penetrated his consciousness. For 6 months, every decision he had made, every meeting he had attended, every casual conversation in the executive break room had been observed and evaluated by someone whose conclusions would determine whether he remained employed or joined the ranks of executives whose corporate obituaries would be discussed in business school case studies about leadership failure. "The Henderson manufacturing situation," Amelia continued, opening a different section of her portfolio to reveal detailed documentation that made several executives visibly flinch, provided an excellent case study in how this leadership team responds to crisis management. "Mr. Drummond, your initial recommendation was to increase service charges to compensate for reduced contract volume, rather than addressing the underlying automation issues that were driving Henderson's transition away from our logistics platform." Marcus tried to respond, but found himself unable to form coherent words as Amelia continued her systematic dissection of his professional judgment. She wasn't attacking him personally, her tone remained clinical and analytical, but the precision of her criticism was far more devastating than any emotional outburst could have been. "Ms. Morrison," she said, turning her attention to Janet with the methodical thoroughness of a surgeon identifying each component of a diseased organ, "your response to the Henderson crisis was to blame our engineering department for failing to anticipate client automation trends, despite the fact that your own operations team had received detailed briefings about industry-wide automation adoption 6 months before Henderson began their transition." Janet Morrison felt her carefully constructed professional identity crumbling as Amelia revealed knowledge of internal communications that Janet had assumed were confidential. The new CEO had somehow gained access to departmental emails, meeting minutes, and strategic planning documents that documented every poor decision and missed opportunity with forensic precision. "Mr. Harrington," Amelia continued, her systematic approach leaving no member of the senior team exempt from her analysis, "your legal review of the Henderson contract modifications took 6 weeks to complete, during which time Henderson's frustration with our responsiveness led them to begin preliminary discussions with our primary competitor about alternative service arrangements. Theodore Harrington's Harvard MBA and inherited confidence were proving worthless against Amelia's detailed documentation of his professional inadequacies. She had observed his work patterns, analyzed his decision-making processes, and identified specific instances where his delays and oversights had directly contributed to Meridian's declining client relationships. "Ms. Fleming," she said, turning to Patricia with the relentless precision of someone working through a comprehensive checklist of leadership failures, "your marketing department's response to client concerns about our service reliability was to launch a public relations campaign emphasizing our historical achievements rather than addressing current performance issues. a strategy that actually drew more attention to our recent problems than ignoring them would have accomplished. Patricia felt physically ill as she realized that Amelia had been watching her fumble through crisis communications with the analytical detachment of a scientist observing laboratory specimens. Every meeting, every strategy session, every confident presentation about marketing solutions had been evaluated by someone who understood that her approaches were making Meridian's problems worse rather than better. Mr. Blackstone, Amelia continued, her voice maintaining its calm, professional tone while delivering assessments that were destroying careers with surgical precision. Your technology department's response time for addressing client concerns has increased by 40% over the past year, despite the addition of 12 new technical support specialists to your team. Ryan Blackstone realized with growing horror that Amelia had access to performance metrics that he had assumed were confidential to his department. She had been tracking response times, analyzing workflow efficiency, and documenting the systematic deterioration of technical services that had occurred under his supposedly expert leadership. Mr. Sterling, she said, focusing her attention on David with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had spent months preparing for this conversation. Your financial projections for the current quarter failed to account for the Henderson situation, the Nakamura project overruns, or the pending contract renegotiations with 3 other major clients, an oversight that will require significant revision of guidance provided to investors and analysts. David Sterling felt his professional competence evaporating under Amelia's systematic examination of his failures. She had apparently been monitoring his financial analyses, comparing his projections with actual performance data, and documenting every instance where his optimistic assumptions had proven disconnected from operational realities. Ms. Westbrook, Amelia said, turning to Catherine with the same clinical precision she had applied to her other colleagues. Your sales team's success rate for new client acquisition has declined by 25% over the past 18 months, while your retention rate for existing clients has dropped to levels that require immediate intervention to prevent further market share erosion. Catherine Westbrook realized that her comfortable assumptions about sales performance had been based on selective data interpretation rather than comprehensive analysis. Amelia had been tracking metrics that Catherine had chosen to ignore, documenting trends that Catherine had rationalized away, and identifying patterns of decline that Catherine had attributed to temporary market conditions rather than systematic leadership failure. The systematic destruction of each executive's professional credibility was being delivered with such calm precision that it felt more like a medical diagnosis than a corporate performance review. Amelia wasn't expressing anger or disappointment. She was simply documenting observable facts about their individual and collective failures with the detached professionalism of someone whose conclusions had been reached through months of careful observation. The most significant finding from my assessment period, she continued, opening yet another section of her portfolio to reveal documentation that made several executives visibly cringe, was the consistent pattern of decision-making that prioritized short-term comfort over long-term viability. This leadership team has spent 2 years managing symptoms rather than addressing causes, treating client complaints as public relations problems rather than operational failures, and maintaining internal processes that optimize for executive convenience rather than company performance. The boardroom had become completely silent except for the soft rustle of papers as Amelia referenced specific examples of each failure she was documenting. The executives sat frozen in their chairs, realizing that every comfortable assumption they had made about their own competence was being systematically dismantled by someone who had observed their actual performance with scientific objectivity. The board of directors specifically asked me to identify which members of this leadership team possessed the adaptability and professional humility necessary to contribute to Meridian's recovery, she said, her voice carrying the finality of someone delivering conclusions that had been reached through comprehensive analysis rather than emotional reaction. As 8 of Meridian Industries' most senior executives waited to learn which of them might survive the corporate restructuring that was clearly about to reshape their professional lives, none of them understood that their fate had actually been determined not by 6 months of covert observation, but by the single hour they had spent demonstrating exactly why the board had concluded that completely new leadership was necessary for the company's survival. The morning sun continued its relentless progression across the Seattle skyline, casting shadows that seemed to grow longer and darker as Amelia prepared to deliver the verdicts that would transform Meridian Industries from a failing bureaucracy into something that might actually deserve to survive in an increasingly competitive business environment. The weight of Amelia's systematic analysis hung in the air like a toxic cloud, but the executives were about to discover that their morning of humiliation was far from over. What they had experienced so far was merely documentation. The real consequences of their failures were about to unfold with the methodical precision of a corporate execution that had been planned months in advance. Amelia reached into her portfolio one final time and withdrew a thick document bound in legal-grade covers that bore the unmistakable letterhead of Meridian Industries' board of directors. The sight of the official documentation sent visible shudders through the assembled executives, who recognized the format typically used for major corporate announcements that fundamentally altered the structure of the organization. The board of directors convened an emergency session yesterday evening, she began, her voice carrying the formal tone of someone delivering official pronouncements that had been carefully crafted by corporate lawyers. Based on my preliminary assessment report, they authorized immediate implementation of what they're calling the Meridian Recovery Protocol, a comprehensive restructuring plan designed to address the systematic leadership failures that have brought this company to the brink of irrelevance. Marcus Drummond felt his stomach drop as he realized that Amelia's 6 months of covert observation had culminated in formal recommendations that had already been approved at the highest levels of corporate governance. This wasn't a performance review or coaching session. It was the execution of a predetermined restructuring plan that would fundamentally reshape Meridian's executive hierarchy. "Mr. Drummond," Amelia said, opening the document to a section marked with yellow tabs, "effective immediately, you are being reassigned from your position as Senior Vice President of Operations to a newly created role as Special Advisor for Process Optimization, reporting directly to the incoming Vice President of Operations who will assume responsibility for your current portfolio." The corporate language was diplomatically phrased, but its meaning was unmistakable. Marcus was being stripped of operational authority and relegated to an advisory position that carried no real decision-making power. He would technically remain employed, but his career trajectory had just been permanently altered in ways that would make him unemployable at his former level anywhere else in the industry. "Ms. Morrison," she continued, her systematic approach leaving no room for interruption or negotiation, "your position as Vice President of Strategic Planning is being eliminated as part of our organizational streamlining initiative. However, the board has authorized the creation of a temporary consulting arrangement that will allow you to complete current projects over the next 90 days, while we transition your responsibilities to more appropriate personnel." Janet Morrison felt the blood drain from her face as she processed the implications of Amelia's announcement. A temporary consulting arrangement was corporate euphemism for a face-saving termination that would allow her to find other employment without the stigma of being immediately fired. But everyone in the industry would understand that her departure from Meridian represented a career-ending failure at the senior executive level. "Mr. Harrington," Amelia said, turning to Theodore with the relentless precision of someone working through a checklist of professional executions, "your legal review processes have been identified as a significant bottleneck in our operational efficiency. You're being transferred to our Regulatory Compliance Division, where your attention to detail can be applied to statutory requirements rather than client-facing initiatives." Theodore's Harvard law degree and family connections were proving worthless against Amelia's systematic dismantling of his professional status. Regulatory compliance was where corporate lawyers went to die professionally, a bureaucratic wasteland where former executives spent their remaining years reviewing government filing requirements rather than participating in strategic business decisions. "Ms. Fleming," she continued, her clinical tone making each announcement sound like a medical diagnosis rather than a career termination, "your marketing initiatives have consistently failed to address the operational realities that drive client satisfaction. You're being reassigned to our Corporate Communications Department, where your public relations skills can be applied to internal employee engagement rather than external client acquisition." Patricia Fleming realized that she was being banished to the corporate equivalent of Siberia. Employee communications was where failed executives were sent to write internal newsletters and organize company picnics until they found the dignity to resign voluntarily. Her dreams of climbing higher in the corporate hierarchy had just been permanently extinguished. "Mr. Blackstone," Amelia said, focusing her attention on Ryan with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had spent months documenting his professional inadequacies, "your technology department will be restructured under new leadership, but your expertise in legacy systems makes you valuable for our digital transition initiatives. You're being reassigned as Senior Technical Consultant for Systems Integration, reporting to our incoming Chief Technology Officer. Ryan understood that his reassignment was slightly more merciful than his colleagues' fates, but Senior Technical Consultant was still a massive demotion that would remove him from strategic decision-making and reduce him to implementing other people's vision rather than developing his own technological initiatives. Mr. Sterling, she continued, her systematic approach ensuring that no member of the senior team escaped the consequences of their collective failures. Your financial projections have consistently failed to reflect operational realities, creating significant credibility issues with investors and analysts. You're being transferred to our Audit Compliance Division, where your analytical skills can be applied to regulatory requirements rather than forward-looking strategic planning. David Sterling felt his professional identity disintegrating as he realized that audit compliance was even worse than regulatory affairs. It was where corporate accountants were sent when they had demonstrated fundamental incompetence in their primary responsibilities. He would spend his remaining years at Meridian reviewing past transactions rather than planning future growth. Ms. Westbrook, Amelia said, delivering her final executive reassignment with the same clinical precision she had applied to the others. Your sales performance metrics indicate systematic problems with client relationship management that require immediate intervention. You're being reassigned as Regional Account Coordinator for our existing client retention program, reporting to our incoming Vice President of Sales. Catherine Westbrook understood that Regional Account Coordinator was corporate language for a sales representative with a fancy title. She was being demoted from executive leadership to individual contributor status, responsible for maintaining relationships with clients rather than developing strategic sales initiatives. The systematic destruction of Meridian's entire senior leadership team had been delivered with such professional courtesy that it took several minutes for the full implications to penetrate the executive's consciousness. They weren't being immediately terminated, but their careers had been effectively ended through reassignments that would make them unemployable at their former levels anywhere else in the corporate world. The board wants to emphasize, Amelia continued, reading from the official document with the formal tone of someone delivering prepared statements, that these reassignments reflect organizational restructuring needs rather than personal performance failures. All affected executives will receive comprehensive transition support, including outplacement services and extended healthcare benefits during their adjustment period. The diplomatic language couldn't disguise the reality that 8 senior executives had just been professionally executed in the most civilized manner possible. They would technically remain employed at Meridian Industries, but their influence, authority, and career prospects had been permanently eliminated through a restructuring process that had been designed to minimize legal liability while maximizing operational effectiveness. Questions about your new reporting relationships and transition timelines should be directed to our Human Resources Department, Amelia concluded, closing the official document with the finality of someone who had just completed an unpleasant but necessary task. Your current access credentials will remain active through the end of the week to facilitate project handovers to your successors. As 8 former executives sat in stunned silence, processing the reality that their comfortable assumptions about corporate hierarchy had been permanently shattered by someone they had dismissed as an insignificant intruder, none of them understood that their fate had been determined not by 6 months of covert assessment, but by the single hour they had spent demonstrating exactly why Meridian Industries needed completely new leadership to survive in an increasingly competitive marketplace. The morning sun had reached its zenith during their systematic professional destruction, casting harsh shadows across the boardroom where 8 careers had just been methodically dismantled by someone who had observed their failures with scientific objectivity and responded with corporate restructuring that would serve as a case study in leadership accountability for business schools throughout the country. The formal announcements of their professional demotions had been delivered with such clinical precision that the former executives sat in a state of psychological shock, staring at the conference table as if it might somehow provide explanations for how their comfortable world of corporate privilege had been so completely dismantled. But Amelia wasn't finished with them yet. She had one more element of her restructuring plan that would demonstrate how fundamentally their assumptions about leadership and competence had been misguided. Before we conclude this meeting, she said, reaching for her phone with the casual efficiency of someone implementing a plan that had been carefully orchestrated months in advance, I'd like you to meet some of the people who will be assuming your former responsibilities. The executives exchanged confused glances, wondering who could possibly have been recruited to replace an entire senior leadership team without anyone noticing the hiring process. Corporate headhunting for executive positions typically took months of interviews, background checks, and careful negotiations that were impossible to conduct in complete secrecy. Amelia pressed a button on the conference room's intercom system. "Please send them up," she said simply, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had been planning this moment for months. Within minutes, the boardroom doors opened to admit 6 individuals who moved with the quiet confidence of people comfortable with professional responsibility. The former executives studied the newcomers with the desperate attention of drowning people watching their replacements walk across the water they had failed to navigate successfully. The first person to enter was a woman in her early 30s with the kind of understated professional presence that commanded attention without demanding it. She carried a portfolio similar to Amelia's and moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to managing complex organizational challenges. "This is Dr. Sarah Chan," Amelia announced, though several of the former executives recognized her immediately with expressions of dawning horror. "She'll be assuming the position of Vice President of Operations, effective immediately." Marcus Drummond felt his world collapse entirely as he realized that Dr. Chun had been working in the strategic planning department for the past 8 months. In the cubicle directly adjacent to where he had frequently held confidential phone conversations about operational challenges he had assumed were too complex for lower-level employees to understand. Dr. Chun holds a PhD in industrial engineering from Stanford and spent 5 years optimizing manufacturing processes for Toyota before joining Meridian. Amelia continued, her introduction revealing qualifications that exceeded Marcus's business school credentials by several orders of magnitude. "She's been observing our operational workflows and has developed comprehensive improvement plans that address the systematic inefficiencies that have plagued this department for the past 2 years. The irony was devastating in its completeness. Marcus had been making decisions about operational efficiency while working 20 feet away from someone whose expertise in process optimization far exceeded his own. Worse, he had occasionally made condescending comments about the analytical types in strategic planning who didn't understand the practical realities of corporate operations. "Our new chief financial officer is James Rodriguez," Amelia said, introducing a man in his mid-40s whose quiet competence had apparently been hidden in plain sight for months. "He's been working as a senior financial analyst while completing the transition from his previous position as CFO of Pacific Northwest Technologies, where he managed the successful restructuring that doubled their market valuation over 3 years. David Sterling stared at James with the expression of someone watching his professional ghost materialize in corporeal form. He had reviewed James's financial analyses dozens of times over the past 6 months, consistently dismissing them as overly conservative projections that failed to account for the growth opportunities that David was certain would materialize despite all evidence to the contrary. Mr. Rodriguez identified the Henderson manufacturing revenue impact 6 months before our existing financial models recognized the trend. Amelia continued, her revelation making David physically ill as he realized that his supposed expertise had been systematically inferior to that of someone he had considered a subordinate. The parade of new executives continued with mathematical precision that made the former leadership team's inadequacies increasingly obvious. Lisa Park, the incoming vice president of sales, had been working as a senior account manager, while her MBA from Wharton and her track record of managing major client relationships at 3 Fortune 500 companies remained invisible to executives who had assumed that competence correlated with organizational hierarchy. Catherine Westbrook realized with growing nausea that she had actually attended several meetings where Lisa had made strategic recommendations about client retention that Catherine had dismissed as coming from someone who lacked the big-picture perspective necessary for senior leadership decisions. The fact that Lisa's recommendations had been consistently superior to Catherine's own strategic initiatives was a revelation that arrived far too late to matter. "Our new chief technology officer is Michael Park," Amelia announced, introducing a man whose innovative approaches to systems integration had apparently been hidden beneath the unremarkable title of senior systems analyst. "He's been developing comprehensive technology modernization plans that address the infrastructure limitations that have constrained our service delivery capabilities for the past 18 months. Ryan Blackstone felt personally betrayed by the revelation that Michael had been working in his own department while possessing qualifications and strategic vision that exceeded Ryan's own technological expertise. Worse, Ryan had occasionally made dismissive comments about the tech support people, who didn't understand the broader business implications of technology decisions. The systematic revelation of superior talent that had been working unrecognized within Meridian's existing organizational structure was more than a simple management change. It was a demonstration of how completely the former leadership team had failed to identify and utilize the competence that had been available to them throughout their tenure. Each of your replacements, Amelia explained, her voice carrying the educational tone of someone delivering a lesson about corporate leadership that would have profound implications for everyone in the room, has been working within this organization for at least 6 months. They've observed your decision-making processes, analyzed the results of your strategic initiatives, and developed comprehensive improvement plans based on direct experience with the consequences of current management approaches. The former executives were beginning to understand that their replacement hadn't been a sudden decision based on Amelia's covert assessment. It had been a carefully planned succession process that had positioned superior talent within the organization while giving them time to observe and learn from the existing leadership team's failures. More importantly, she continued, opening her portfolio to reveal organizational charts that showed reporting relationships and communication patterns that the former executives had never bothered to analyze. Each of them has demonstrated the kind of collaborative leadership style that prioritizes organizational success over personal recognition, a characteristic that has been notably absent from this leadership team's operational approach. Janet Morrison realized with crushing clarity that Amelia wasn't just replacing incompetent executives with competent ones. She was implementing a completely different philosophy of corporate leadership that emphasized collective achievement over individual authority. The new team would succeed not just because they were more skilled, but because they understood that sustainable success required the kind of collaborative approach that the former leadership team had never bothered to develop. As 6 new executives took seats around the conference table with the quiet confidence of people who had been preparing for these responsibilities for months, the former leadership team found themselves occupying an increasingly uncomfortable position as observers of their own professional replacement. They had been transformed from corporate leaders into case studies in leadership failure, watching their successors implement the kinds of strategic initiatives that they had consistently failed to develop despite having access to superior resources and organizational authority. The morning light streaming through the boardroom windows had shifted again during the introduction of Meridian's new leadership team, casting shadows that seemed to emphasize the contrast between the former executives' diminished positions and their replacements' obvious competence and collaborative energy. The transformation of Meridian Industries' boardroom from a temple of entrenched privilege to a laboratory of collaborative leadership was complete, but the story's implications extended far beyond the personal catastrophe that had befallen 8 former executives. What had unfolded over the course of a single morning represented a fundamental shift in how corporate power could be distributed and how assumptions about competence could be challenged by observable reality. Within hours of the leadership transition, news of the dramatic restructuring began spreading through Meridian's lower floors with the viral intensity of information that confirmed what employees had suspected for years. The quiet woman from strategic planning who had occasionally been seen in the executive elevators wasn't just another mid-level analyst. She was the architect of a corporate revolution that had systematically identified and promoted actual competence over inherited privilege. The reaction from Meridian's workforce was immediate and profound. Employees who had spent years watching their innovative suggestions disappear into the black hole of middle management suddenly found themselves working for leaders who not only recognized good ideas but had the authority and competence to implement them effectively. The collaborative leadership style that Amelia had identified as essential for organizational success wasn't just theoretical. It was being demonstrated daily by executives who understood that sustainable achievement required collective effort rather than individual brilliance. Dr. Sarah Chen's approach to operations management proved to be everything that Marcus Drummond's leadership had lacked. Within her first week as vice president of operations, she implemented workflow improvements that reduced processing times by 30% while simultaneously improving quality metrics that had been declining under the previous management structure. More importantly, she did so by soliciting input from frontline employees who had been developing innovative solutions for months, while waiting for someone in authority to recognize their contributions. The Henderson manufacturing situation that had seemed like an intractable crisis under the former leadership team was resolved within 2 weeks through Dr. Chen's systematic approach to client relationship management. Rather than viewing Henderson's automation initiatives as a threat to be managed through contract modifications, she recognized them as an opportunity to demonstrate Meridian's adaptability and developed service packages that actually enhanced the value proposition for clients implementing technological improvements. James Rodriguez's financial management philosophy proved equally transformative. His conservative projections that David Sterling had dismissed as lacking vision were actually based on comprehensive risk analysis that accounted for market realities rather than wishful thinking. Within a month of assuming the CFO position, he had restructured Meridian's financial reporting to provide real-time operational metrics that allowed for proactive rather than reactive management decisions. The Nakamura project that had been hemorrhaging resources and credibility under the previous leadership was completely reconceptualized under the new management approach. Rather than trying to salvage a fundamentally flawed implementation through increased spending, the new team conducted a thorough requirements analysis that revealed the original scope had been based on sales promises that were technically impossible to fulfill with existing resources. Lisa Park's approach to client relationship management demonstrated how sales success could be achieved through honesty rather than optimistic misrepresentation. She contacted Nakamura directly to propose a modified project scope that would deliver genuine value within realistic timelines and budgets. The client's response was immediate relief. They had been concerned about Meridian's promises but hadn't wanted to acknowledge publicly that their vendor appeared to be over-promising and under-delivering. Michael Park's technology modernization initiatives began paying dividends almost immediately as he implemented infrastructure improvements that had been delayed for years under Ryan Blackstone's management. But more importantly, he established communication protocols between the technology and sales departments that ensured technical capabilities and client promises remained aligned, rather than diverging into the kind of impossible commitments that had characterized the previous leadership approach. The financial results of the leadership transition exceeded even Amelia's optimistic projections. Within 3 months, Meridian's client satisfaction scores had improved by 40%, new contract acquisition had increased by 25%, and employee retention rates had reached levels not seen since the company's early growth years. The stock price recovery was so dramatic that industry analysts began studying Meridian as a case study in rapid corporate turnaround. But the most significant transformation was cultural rather than financial. The new leadership team had created an environment where competence was recognized regardless of organizational hierarchy, where innovative thinking was encouraged rather than discouraged, and where collaborative problem-solving replaced the kind of territorial competition that had characterized the previous management structure. Employees throughout the organization began contributing ideas and solutions that had been suppressed under the former leadership's assumption that strategic thinking was the exclusive province of senior executives. The result was an explosion of innovative approaches to operational challenges that generated improvements nobody had anticipated when the restructuring was first implemented. The 8 former executives found themselves experiencing corporate life from an entirely different perspective as they adjusted to their new roles as individual contributors rather than strategic decision-makers. For some, the transition proved impossible. Theodore Harrington and Patricia Fleming submitted their resignations within 6 weeks, unable to adapt to working environments where their contributions were evaluated based on results rather than title or personal connections. Others discovered that their new positions actually suited their capabilities better than the executive roles they had previously occupied. Marcus Drummond's attention to detail proved valuable in process optimization consulting, while David Sterling's analytical skills were effectively utilized in audit compliance where precision mattered more than vision. The story of Amelia's transformation from invisible analyst to corporate leader became legendary within Meridian Industries, but its significance extended far beyond a single company's management transition. It served as proof that competence often exists in forms that traditional corporate hierarchies fail to recognize, that assumptions about authority based on appearance or position can blind organizations to their own resources, and that sustainable success requires leaders who understand collaboration rather than domination. Industry publications began analyzing the Meridian model as an example of how organizations could identify and develop internal talent that had been overlooked by conventional management approaches. Business schools incorporated the case study into their curricula as an illustration of how systematic assessment could reveal leadership capabilities that had been hidden by organizational assumptions about competence and authority. The quiet woman who had walked into a boardroom full of hostile executives and transformed their contempt into professional development opportunities had demonstrated something far more important than individual achievement. She had proven that legends aren't necessarily people who demand recognition, Sometimes they're the individuals who work quietly and competently until circumstances force their true capabilities into visibility. In corporate environments where authority is often confused with competence, and where assumptions about leadership are based on appearance rather than results, Amelia's story serves as a reminder that extraordinary capability often exists in ordinary disguises. The next time someone dismisses a colleague based on title, position, or appearance, they might be overlooking the very person whose vision and competence could transform their organization from mediocrity to excellence. The boardroom where 8 executives had learned the difference between inherited privilege and earned authority now serves as Meridian Industries' primary conference room, where collaborative leadership continues to generate the kind of sustainable success that can only be achieved when competence is recognized wherever it exists and whenever it chooses to reveal itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.